tragedy strikes us, the first questions usually asked is, why me? Why did this happen to me? Noted author and lecturer Dr. Harold Kushner offers a moving and humane approach to understanding life's unexpected events. Drawing from his own personal tragedy of his son's early death, Dr. Kushner has developed a meaningful message that gives us all a better understanding of life and death. Please join us as we present Dr. Harold Kushner in a discussion of when bad things happen to good people. This program was recorded at Ovens Auditorium in Charlotte, North Carolina, when Dr. Harold Kushner presented the keynote address at the annual Conference of Life and Death sponsored by To Life.
Now, I'm really very pleased to be here tonight and just so delighted that all of you would come out. It never fails to amaze me that I can come to a city where I've never been before, like Charlotte, where I virtually don't know anybody, and there'll be hundreds and hundreds of people who know me, who feel that they knew my son Aaron, and who want to come out and hear me talk about what the experience has taught me. You live long enough, you care about enough people, and inevitably you will find yourself asking why good people have to suffer. You will see the wrong people sick and the wrong people dying, the wrong people divorced and the wrong people unemployed and the wrong people hurt by life. You will look at that and you will say, why? I don't understand it. If there is a God in this world, why do things like this happen? And why do they happen to her? Why do they happen to him? The death at age 14 of our son Aaron from that rare growth disorder, progeria, the rapid aging syndrome which turned his body into the body of an old man when he was still a child. You may remember about 2.5 years ago, the two boys who came to Disney World, the boy from South Africa, the boy from Texas, they had that same illness, progeria, that our son Aaron had died of 4 years before. We found out when Aaron was 3 what his life would be like, how short it would be and how full of pain it would be. And that was hard to take. But what made it even harder was that when I, as a clergyman, tried to say to myself the same things that I was used to saying to other people in their sorrow, when I gave myself the same answers I'd been giving them, I found out with a shock that these words were not comforting. All those years, I thought I was helping people when I would sit with them and explain to them why this was happening in their family. But when I was on the receiving end of those words, I wasn't helped at all. People came when they found out how sick Aaron was, and they sat with my wife and myself, friends, neighbors, family, colleagues in the clergy, and they tried to make us feel better and make sense of it. And we heard all the conventional explanations, and none of them made us feel better. People said to us, God is sending this to your family because you're so strong in your faith that you can handle it, and you'll be an inspiration to others. And all I could think of at the moment was, I wish I were a less religious person. Let God make an example of some other family, and I would have a healthy son. People said to us, if you're a man of faith, you don't question God, you bow your head before his will. But I was full of questions, and I was full of rage and pain, and I didn't want anyone to take away my right to feel hurt and to feel angry. People said to us, there are reasons for it which you can't understand now. Someday you'll understand them. I was doing a radio program in Chicago one night on WGN, one of these call-in shows. You know, listeners call in with their questions. A woman called in and said to me, Rabbi Kushner, why can't you accept the idea that God wanted your son to die so that you would become a more sensitive person and write this wonderful book which is going to enrich the lives of thousands? Isn't it worth one life to enrich the lives of thousands? I said to her, remember we're in Chicago now, I said to her, ma'am, do you remember John Gacy? I wonder how many of you remember John Gacy, this madman who killed those little boys and buried them in his basement in Illinois. I said, suppose John Gacy's defense attorney had gotten up in an Illinois court, or suppose Wayne Williams' defense attorney had gotten up in Atlanta and said, instead of pleading insanity, had said, sure, my client killed those children, but he's not a murderer, he's a hero. Look at what he's achieved. All over America, Tens of millions of parents are grateful that their children are alive and well because my client never got his hands on them. All over America, parents are going to be much more vigilant where their sons go when they leave the house because they've read about John Wayne Gacy. Well, we wouldn't take that line of reasoning seriously in court for a moment. It's ridiculous. Why should we take it more seriously when word for word somebody says the same thing about God? That God would torture and kill an innocent child so other people would grow and benefit? That God does not hold every human soul to be uniquely precious? If a human being were to do that, it would be a sin. If a human being were to use a person as a means to an end, if you were to get involved with a member of the opposite sex without taking him or her seriously just to boost your own ego, if you were to make friends with somebody not because you liked him, but because you wanted to use him, you wanted to sell him something, take advantage of his friendship, that would be blaspheming against the divine image in every human. How could God do such a thing? How could God torture one person so that other people would grow as a result? I have never been impressed with the argument that God causes some children to be born retarded so the woman next door will feel grateful that her kids are normal. That God strikes one man blind so we can feel virtuous dropping a quarter in his cup. I'm not moved by that. You know what that sounds like to me? That sounds like the story that Sammy Levinson used to tell. Remember Sammy Levinson? He used to tell the story when he started first grade, his mother came and said to the first grade teacher, "If my boy Sammy ever misbehaves, hit the kid next to him. He learns by example." We heard all the conventional answers, the explanations, the justifications that tried to make sense of our tragedy, and none of them made us feel any better. And one day I realized why. You know why? It's really very simple. They weren't supposed to comfort us. They weren't supposed to make us feel better. They were intended to defend and justify God. To say to hurting people, you have nothing to complain about. You have no right to cry out, what's happening to you is right and good and it makes sense. God knows just what he's doing. And I'm sorry, I would like to think if we could ask God, that God would say, forget about me, forget about my reputation. Really, I can take care of myself. You bring healing and comfort to my bleeding children on earth. But nobody who sat with us was that wise. I went through a very serious crisis when we found out what our son's life would be like. I found myself asking, can I continue as a religiously affirming person? Or is everything I have spent my life teaching a lie? I asked myself, can I continue as a rabbi, watching other people's children grow up and knowing that my son would never grow up? And what helped me through my crisis was going back to the Bible and rereading the book of Job, the classical biblical discussion of the good man who suffers. It was a book I thought I knew. I had studied it in rabbinic seminary. I had written papers on Job. I had taught Job. But now I was reading Job not as a Bible student. I was reading it as Job, as the man who raised his hand to heaven and said, why? Why me? Why my children? And I found things in the book I'd never found before. You remember the story, don't you? Job is this totally righteous, completely innocent man whose world falls apart. His wealth is destroyed. His children are killed. He comes down with this terrible sickness. 3 friends come and they try and comfort him and make him feel better. They say to Job, cheer up, Job. Nobody ever suffered unless there was a good reason for it. And Job says, strange thing, I don't find that a cheering thought. I find it useful to diagram the philosophical argument, 38 chapters of brilliant philosophical poetry in the book of Job, in the following way. There are 3 ideas which everyone in the book wants to believe. First, God is in charge. God is all-powerful. Nothing happens in this world unless God wants it to happen. That's number one. Two, God is good. He is kind and fair and just. He gives us what we deserve, or better than what we deserve. He gives us the benefit of the doubt and a second chance. And three, Job is a good person. Got that straight? One, God is all-powerful. Two, God is good. Three, Job is a good man. As long as Job is healthy, wealthy, and respected, you can believe all three of those with no conflict. No problem, right? When Job starts to suffer, when he gets sick, when his children die, you can no longer affirm all three of those simultaneously. You can affirm any two. Figure it out. All combinations work. You can affirm any two only by denying the third. And the drama in Job, the argument in the biblical book of Job, is over which of those three are you prepared to give up so that you can affirm the other two. Job's friends, the three who came to comfort him, have no problem. It is so important for them to affirm what they were taught in Sunday school. God is good and God is powerful. The only possible conclusion is to deny proposition number 3, that Job is a good man. And so they say to Job, come off it, stop complaining. God doesn't make mistakes, people make mistakes. We've read Sigmund Freud. We know how human beings repress things they're ashamed of. You must have done something really terrible in your past, and you hid it from us, and you hid it from yourself, but you couldn't fool God, and he has come to chastise you and to force you to confront your sin. Stop acting so self-righteous. Stop feeling sorry for yourself. Get down on your knees and beg God to forgive you, and then he will stop teaching you a lesson. And they call that comfort. You know what they're doing? They are playing the game that we today have learned to call blaming the victim. Making sense of life's tragedies by saying to the person who is suffering, you must have done something to deserve this, otherwise why would God make it happen to you? Hurting the person a second time, because now he not only has to suffer the original crime, sin, misfortune, he has to suffer our condemning and judging him as well. A woman is attacked and assaulted on the street, and instead of saying to her what a horrible, defiling experience that must have been, we say to her, why were you walking alone at night? Why were you dressed so provocatively? You must have done something terrible to provoke this kind of attack, and that's why it happened to you and not to us, because there's nothing that goes on in the world that we don't deserve. I tell the story in my book of the young woman whose husband walks out on her, and she's crushed and rejected, and she goes home to her parents, and all her mother can think of to say to her is, what did you do wrong? Did you nag him too much? Did you spend too much of his money? What did you do to force him to do this to you? The survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, instead of saying to them, you have endured the most horrible nightmare that any human being has ever experienced, instead of that, we say, you know, maybe if the Jews of Germany hadn't been so conspicuous, you would not have become Hitler's targets. Blaming the victim. Because we can't let ourselves admit that good people suffer in this world. When we find a person suffering, we say, well, I guess he's really not good. I quote this horrible proverb in my book, I've forgotten where I read it now, that goes, if you see a blind man, kick him. Why should you be kinder than God? That is, if you see a person who's suffering and you believe in God, you must believe that there's a good reason for his suffering. Whose side are you going to be on? Job can't accept that answer. He is not prepared to purchase the world's innocence, the world's integrity at the cost of his own. Maybe he's not perfect, but really? Is he so much more a sinner than the people across the street? Their children are alive. Is he so much more terrible than the man next door? He's still got his business flourishing. Why is this happening to him? Job's answer is to deny proposition number 2, that God is good. I'm innocent, says Job, And God is great. God is so great that he is not limited by considerations of justice and fairness, because that would be a limitation on God's power. To say that God can't do something to us because we don't deserve it is to limit God's power. Job would say, if we by our righteousness could compel God to give us what we want, if we could come to church on Sunday or to synagogue on Friday night and say, now look here, God, I have been honest, I have been faithful, I have been religious, I have been generous. You owe me a week of good health and seeing my money market funds go up. And God had to do it because we'd earned it. Is he still God? Or have we reduced God to a kind of cosmic vending machine? You put in your tokens, you pull the lever, and if you don't get what you ask for, you're entitled to kick and curse the machine and take your business elsewhere. Job would say, God is so great, he doesn't have to be fair. He can't be limited. So in the book, he is always saying things like, would that there were an umpire between us to make God play fair. Would that somebody could force God to come down and justify himself, explain himself, but nobody can make God do anything. He can do whatever he wants. He is so great that he is not obliged to be kind or fair or anything. Good answer? I think it's a terrible answer. I don't like that answer. To say that God is not committed to justice and mercy as you and I understand those words? Great. Who wrote all those words in Scripture? Justice, justice shall you pursue. Do justly and love mercy and walk humbly with your God. Deal kindly with the widow, the orphan, the stranger, if God doesn't stand for those things. More importantly, if God is not committed to justice and compassion, who teaches us to be righteously indignant when we read about injustice being done? Who teaches us to reach out in compassion to people who are suffering if this has nothing to do with God? My traditional friends, my Orthodox Jewish friends, my fundamentalist Christian friends, if I still have any, they're always saying to me, Kushner, if something happens, if God does something which you can't understand, maybe the problem is not with God, maybe it's with you. Maybe the problem is you can't understand it. Can't God do things too wondrous for you to comprehend? And I say, well, of course God can. That's not the issue. That's not what I'm talking about. Yes, God can do things I can't understand. My plumber does things I can't understand. My 17-year-old daughter does things I can't understand. Sure, God can do things I can't understand. That's not what we're talking about. The question I'm raising is not that God does things too wondrous for me. A child falls into a swimming pool and drowns. What's to understand? We understand it all too well. A young husband and father is killed by a drunk driver. What is it that is too wondrous for us to understand? We understand it perfectly clearly. The issue is, will God do things which he himself has said are wrong? I locate myself in the honorable Jewish tradition, which says it is legitimate to call God to account in the name of his own standards of justice. From Abraham in the Bible, who says to God at Sodom and Gomorrah, how can a God of justice do things which are unjust? You can't destroy that city if there are innocent people living there. To Job, to Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, who says, God, if you don't treat your people Israel better than this, we're going to stop worshiping you and go see what kind of world you'll have then. My answer, and I think it may be the answer of the author of the book of Job, I'm not totally sure, but I find this answer there, whether he put it there or not. My answer is the one alternative that nobody else has taken. If Job's friends solve the riddle by denying proposition number 3, Job is not a good person. If Job himself solves it by denying proposition number 2, God is great, but he's not just. And I don't like either of those answers. My answer is to deny proposition number 1 and to say maybe God isn't all-powerful. Maybe he is very great, but not totally in control. I confess it is an answer I was very reluctant to come to. Like all of you, I was raised to believe that everything that happens is God's will, and if we don't understand it, it's our limitation. Like all of you, I would rather believe that somebody is driving the bus. But if I see innocent people suffering, and to understand it, I have to choose between a powerful God who is not kind and just, or else a kind and just God who is not powerful, you tell me which is the more religious alternative. I got a letter from a Lutheran minister in a small town in Nebraska who told me the following story. He had to do a funeral one day for a 26-year-old man who was scheduled to be married in his church the same weekend. The man had gone out with a few friends for a bachelor party. Leaving the restaurant, they were run into by a drunk driver and killed. The same day, the same church, almost the same hour for which his wedding had been scheduled, they did the funeral, buried him in the church courtyard. Minister came back to his office, and the man's fiancée is waiting for him there. Says to him, "Pastor, if one more person tells me it was God's will, I'm going to scream. Why are they teaching me to hate God?" Because I think that's what we do when we attribute every undeserved tragedy, every disaster to God's will. We teach people either to hate themselves for deserving it, or to hate God for doing it to them when they didn't deserve it. But if God doesn't cause these things, if he doesn't want them to happen and can't prevent them, where do they come from? What could possibly make them happen if they're not the will of God? Couple of possibilities. Sometimes I believe bad things happen to good people because laws of nature can't tell the difference between a good person and a bad one. A falling rock has no way of knowing whom it's falling on and whether he deserves to be hit by the rock or not. You cross a busy highway at peak traffic time and you run the risk of being hit and injured by a car, even if you're a good person whose family loves you, and even if you have the best reason in the world for having to cross that road in a hurry. You go into a house where there's a contagious disease, and you run the risk of contracting that disease, irrespective of why you're there. You can be a doctor, you can be a burglar. Germs don't know the difference. Thin ice, speeding bullets, falling rocks, out-of-control automobiles, they don't know the difference either. This, by the way, is my argument with the insurance companies. What they call acts of God, I think, is taking the Lord's name in vain. A flood is not an act of God. A forest fire is not an act of God. It's an act of nature, blind, amoral nature, churning its way through the world and not knowing whose home is getting in its way. But the community that pulls together to rebuild itself after the flood, after the fire, that, I believe, is the act of God. I believe God created this world. I have to believe that. I mean, look at the world. It is so complex, so intricate, it works, and it is so beautiful. You can sit and look at the mountains for an hour, and you feel tranquil. And a television program that costs $3 million to produce, you get bored with after 5 minutes. No, this has to be God's world. But I believe that when God created the world, he withheld from the natural world one of his divine blessings that he only shared with you and me, and that is the ability to know the difference between good and bad. Human beings have that capacity. Falling rocks, speeding bullets, disease germs don't have it. And sometimes good people suffer in this world because laws of nature don't make any exception for the fact that they're good. Sometimes I believe bad things happen to people who deserve better, because it's very important for me to affirm God created us free to choose how we want to live. And if we choose to be good, honest, helpful people, we get the credit. If we choose to be bad, dishonest, destructive, deceitful people, we, not God, get the blame. A man goes into a late-night convenience store to hold up the store, shoots the clerk. Don't ask, why would God do this to an innocent child? put the blame where it belongs, not on God, on the robber. In my book, I quote a German Christian theologian, a Lutheran woman named Dorothy Zola, writing about the Holocaust, asking the question that every one of us has asked: where was God at Auschwitz? Her answer, you want to know what she says? Her answer is, where was God? God was at the side of the victims, grieving and hurting and dying with them, not on the side of the murderers. Dorothy Zola says, to suggest by word or implication that what the Nazis did to innocent men, women, and children was in any way God's will, that he wanted it to happen as part of some master plan, is to offer us a God so cruel that no decent person should ever worship him. And I agree with Dorothy Zola. For me, the Holocaust is not a theological question, where was God? For me, it's a psychological question. How could people have done such things to each other? How could human beings have so grossly misused the freedom to choose which God gave us? But I don't want you to go away tonight thinking that I believe in a God who is an innocent bystander, a God who created the world and gave it a push and then retired, and from time to time looks down from heaven, shakes his head and said, what a pity, I hoped it would turn out better. No, I believe in a God. I believe in a God who actively intervenes in the lives of people who are suffering. He does not send the pain, the problem, the tragedy. He sends us the ability to transcend and survive it. What does God do for us? First of all, I suspect he's given us a world where natural laws apply regularly and constantly. I don't understand why one person gets cancer and another person doesn't. I don't understand why one person comes down with Alzheimer's disease and another doesn't. But I suspect that somewhere in the laws of biology there are answers to that. And when we care enough to spend as much money on medical research as we spend on cigarettes and cosmetics to make us sick, we will start finding the answers. When we start paying medical researchers what we pay quarterbacks and left fielders in the United States, we will find the answers. Some of you who are here tonight, some of you in the audience who are my age will understand and remember why my mother wouldn't let me go swimming in Brooklyn in June when I was 16 years old. Do you remember? We were afraid of polio. Every summer there would be a polio epidemic, and you had to watch over your children to make sure they didn't get chilled. God forbid they could be crippled or worse. What happened? We cared enough to give our dimes and our dollars, and somebody found out what causes polio and how you prevent it. And now mothers don't have to worry about their children being crippled by polio in the summer, as they don't have to worry about being disfigured by smallpox, or laid low with yellow fever, or a long list of ailments which used to wipe out whole communities, which used to cause people to raise their hands to heaven and say, God, why are you doing this to us? But instead of asking God why, we applied our God-given intelligence to the problem, and we reduced the amount of undeserved suffering that goes on in this world. What does God do for people who have been hurt by life and who deserve better? I think sometimes the best line in my book is a line I didn't write. I quote a 19th century Hasidic rabbi who said, human beings are God's language. Do you understand what he meant by that? Human beings are God's language. You are hurting. You cry out to God. How did you expect God to answer? Did you think he would send you a letter from heaven written in Latin, English, or Hebrew, depending on your religious preference? God answers our cry by coming to us in the incarnation of caring people, doctors and nurses who work through the night to help us. Really, did you ever think about that? That a person with an expensive car and a six-figure income will get up at 2 in the morning and come sit with us because we are in pain. God comes to us in the incarnation of friends and neighbors who overcome their natural squeamishness to sit with us, to know that we're not alone. I love the story of the little boy whose mother sends him on an errand, and it takes him a long time to come home. When he finally gets back, his mother says, "Hey, where were you? I was worried about you." And the boy says, "Oh, there's this kid down the street whose tricycle broke, and he was crying because he couldn't fix it, so I stopped to help him." Mother says, "Wait a minute, don't tell me you know how to fix a tricycle." The boy says, "No, of course not. I sat down and I helped him cry." And you know, he's right. He's right, that is what helps. Would you think back for a moment to the last time you were really down? The last time you were feeling lousy? Rejection, frustration, bereavement, sickness, whatever it was that had you feeling bad. What got you out of that bad feeling? Your theology or your friends? I would bet it was your friends. People who sat with you and helped you cry so that you wouldn't have to cry alone. For the next 5 minutes, I want to stop being philosophical and become very practical. And if you forget or if you reject everything else I say tonight and only remember the next 5 minutes, it will have been worth my coming to Charlotte. Should you know anybody who's going through a hard time and you're not sure whether you ought to intrude because you don't know what to say that will help her, because maybe she wants her privacy at a time like this, because you only make her feel worse. You're happily married and she's divorced or widowed. Your kids are on the honor roll and your friend's children are in trouble with the police. You've got a good job and your friend has been laid off. If you're not sure if you ought to do something, please listen to this. You must reach out and show that person that you care, that you're thinking about her. Stop in and talk, call, send a card, ask what you can do. Please don't wait for your friend to pawn his dignity and ask you for help. You reach out first. It's so important. You know why? When something bad happens to us, there's a crazy little corner of our brain that says to us, aha, you did something wrong and now you're being punished for it. And now that your punishment is public and everybody sees what you're going through, they will know what a sinner you are and they will reject you too. When we stay away because we don't know what to say, we understand it's our own limitation that's keeping us from our friend's side. But our friend doesn't know that. He thinks we're rejecting him. The woman who has been widowed or divorced, her friends are uncomfortable around her because she represents a threat, a potentiality so scary they can't handle it. They know it's their own weakness that keeps them away. But she doesn't know that. She feels she's been rejected by her husband, rejected by God, and now she's been rejected by her friends too. That's why it's so important we reach out and show that we care. You don't know what to say? I'll give you a quick course in what to say to a friend who's going through a hard time. If you want to take notes so you'll remember this, you can write it down. Listening? Say, "I'm sorry," and then keep your mouth shut and hold somebody's hand and listen. You will help more by listening than by trying to explain. The most important thing I have learned is that when a person says, "Why me? Why my family?" that's not a question. It's not a question. It sounds like a question. It is a cry of pain. And you help the person who says, "Why is this happening to me?" not by answering his question, but by easing his pain. You know that. You just didn't realize you know it. Your best friend says to you, "What did I ever do to deserve this?" Does he want you to give him a list of things he did to deserve this? People going through a hard time don't want explanation. They want consolation. They don't want theology. They want reassurance. They don't want to be told that there's a good reason why this is happening to them. They want to be told that you care about them, that there's no good reason, that they don't deserve it, that you can't understand it. You know what you do with suffering, with tragedy? You don't explain it. You don't justify it. You survive it. That is the only thing you do with it. I have overcome my natural inclination to give long, complicated theological answers. I've learned to keep my mouth shut and hug people and hold their hands and sit with them and not try to make sense of it and not try to explain it, but simply be there and say, "I'm sorry for you. You don't deserve going through this. You're too nice a person." Human beings are God's language. Let me tell you one story. It may be my most favorite story of all. It's true. Our son Aaron played the violin. And because he was so small, because the progeria kept him the size of a 3-year-old even when he was a teenager, he had to play this tiny little, almost toy-sized fiddle, get a very tinny, scratchy sound out of it. One day, the bridge on his violin broke. Do you know what that is? It's that black piece of wood that holds the strings up. And in all of Boston, we could not find a replacement bridge for it. So we had to wait till the next time we were in New York, went into the biggest, best-known musical supply store in all of New York City to see if they had a replacement bridge. They did. While they're putting it on, the daughter of the owner of the company comes out, sees this strange-looking child with this tiny little violin, introduces herself. We introduce her to Aaron. He plays a little bit for her. She is so moved by this physically handicapped child trying to lead a normal life that a week later we get a letter from her asking if we'd be willing to accept as a gift the violin which had been handmade for her as a 4-year-old prodigy in Germany, so Aaron could get a better tone when he practiced. Human beings are God's language, people who would sit with us and help us cry, so we would know we were not left to cry alone. And one more thing that God does for us when we're hurting, it may be the most important of all. I have to introduce this with a story which you may have trouble believing. It was June 1981, and I announced to my family that my goal for the summer of 1981 was to get into shape to run the Falmouth Road Race. This is a mini marathon, a 7-mile race that takes place in Cape Cod every August. It's a big deal. Everybody in Falmouth is involved in it. Everybody else has to choose between participating in the race or watching it. I'm lucky. The way I run, I get to do both. To encourage me in my efforts to get into shape to run 7 miles, my daughter bought me a T-shirt, which I still have and I still wear when I work out. And on the back of this T-shirt, she had imprinted Isaiah 40:31. That's what it says on my T-shirt, Isaiah 40:31. If you check your Bibles, you will see that the verse in question reads, "Those who trust the Lord will have their strength renewed. They shall run and not grow weary." Didn't work. That is to say, it didn't help me the summer I ran Falmouth, but it's helped me a lot ever since. I guess that verse has become the cornerstone of my biblical faith. That when we run out of strength, when we have used up all our strength and all our hope and all our patience, we turn to God in trust and He gives us more so we can continue. People are constantly asking me if I believe in miracles. And I say, yes, of course, I absolutely do believe in miracles. But I believe in big miracles, not small ones. Small miracles, splitting the Red Sea, making the sun stand still, no. I'm sorry, those are not miracles, those are special effects. You don't have to be God to split the Red Sea. Cecil B. DeMille does it just as well. Steven Spielberg does it better. You know what's a real miracle? When timid people become brave, and when weak people become strong, and when selfish people become generous. That's a miracle. Cecil B. DeMille can't make that happen. You have to be God to make that happen. When people suddenly come up with qualities of soul that they know they did not have last week or the day before yesterday, and today they have them, where do they get those qualities from? You know why I can believe in God? After everything that's happened in my family and in the families of other people I care about? I believe in God not because of the cosmological proof or the ontological proof or the argument from design or the first cause. All those things we learned about in Philosophy 1, they're really very important for passing Philosophy 1 and for nothing else in life. I believe in God because I am constantly seeing ordinary people do extraordinary things. And if you think about it, you're constantly seeing it too. If a plane crashes in Washington and hits the 14th Street Bridge, that's not God's will, that's just physics. But that Lenny Skutnik should be walking by at that moment. And for the first time in his life, this very ordinary bureaucrat does something heroic. And without knowing what he's doing, he finds himself in the Potomac saving the stewardess. That's an act of God. That's God intervening to give us a quality of strength we never had before. I think of the family in my congregation who 11 years ago gave birth to a brain-damaged child. And every day for 11 years, they get the child up, and they dress him because he's never learned to dress himself. And they feed him breakfast because he can't feed himself. And they sing to him, and they play with him, and they look for a school where he can be with other children. I look at these people and I say, what's going on here? I thought I knew these people. Very ordinary, average people, not particularly religious, not particularly spiritual, not terribly well educated. It is inconceivable to me that 11 years ago they had an endless supply of patience and love and strength. I don't know anybody who has that. It must be that when you have been as brave as you can be for as long as you can, and you've used up all your courage and all your love and all your strength, you turn to God, and he gives you more so you can continue. I think of people who never got along that well with their parents, and their parents become old and sick and have cancer, and the children have to drive them to radiation therapy and take them home, and help them up the stairs and help them go to the bathroom and cook for them. And all of a sudden, these people develop a capacity not just to feel obliged, but authentically to love their parents and to sacrifice for them without feeling like martyrs. Where does somebody suddenly come up with qualities of soul they did not have before? Unless that verse on my t-shirt is really true. When you trust in God, you can turn to him when you've run out of strength, and he renews your strength, so you can run and not grow weary, so you can walk and not feel faint. But you know, I could tell you stories like that all night long, and I would not have answered the question that most of you brought here tonight. Why do good people have to suffer in God's world? And I'll tell you something, I don't have an answer for it. I don't know why they have to suffer. And if I did, I wouldn't tell you, because telling you, I would be like Job's comforters. I would be like all the people who sat with my wife and me when they found out Aaron was sick and tried to persuade us that it really made sense, there was a good answer for it. It doesn't make sense, and there is no good answer for it. It's rotten and painful and unfair, and you shouldn't accept it. If by answer we mean explanation, I don't have an answer. But you know, the word answer doesn't only mean explanation. An answer can also be a response. Not why did it happen, but what are we going to do now that it has happened? I could have called my book Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, but I called it When, because I don't want to talk about why. I want to talk about what you do when you find yourself in sorrow. People come to me and they say, Rabbi, why? Why me? Why my mother? And I say to them, I understand how you feel. I've been there and I've asked that question too. But please understand, why is the wrong question. Because why focuses on the past. And the longer you focus on the past, the more helpless you feel. No matter how smart you are, no matter how pious you are, you can't change the past. It's already happened. So turn around and don't look only at the past. Look at the future. And instead of asking why, ask, what am I going to do now? How do I find the strength and the grace to go on? I got through my crisis by reading the biblical book of Job and one other book, Archibald MacLeish's play, J.B., his modern telling of the Job story. For the first two-thirds of the play, Archibald MacLeish tells the Bible story in modern dress. His hero, his Job figure, is a modern, affluent, somewhat complacent businessman whose world falls apart one day. His children are killed, his business is destroyed, he gets sick. Three friends come to try and console him, and MacLeish is so wonderful with what he does with the three friends. One is a Marxist, one is a psychiatrist, and one is a clergyman. And they all try to make sense of Job's suffering, and none of them makes Job feel any better. Till now, MacLeish is just repeating the Bible story. When he comes to the end, he changes the ending. Do you remember how the story ends in the Bible? Remember chapter 42 of Job? God appears, and God says to Job, it's time to let you in on the secret. This was all an experiment. I wanted to see if you would get upset if I killed your children. I wanted to see if you would question your faith if you suffered. Job, I'm proud of you. You passed the test. Here's your reward. Twice as much health, twice as much wealth, twice as many children. You see, you're better off than you were before. MacLeish, like me, and I suspect like many of you, doesn't like that ending. What does it say about God? About a God who would kill innocent children as part of a sadistic experiment on his most faithful follower, and then thinks you make it up to him by giving him more children. So he changes the ending. And instead of God rewarding Job, Job forgives God. Job forgives God for not making a perfect world, for putting us down in an unfair world where no matter how good, how innocent, how pious you are, illness and accident and human cruelty happen to you as much as they happen to anybody else. Job goes back to his wife, and they're going to go on living together. It is their love for each other, not God's generosity, which will make new children happen. Life has hurt them so badly. Life has taken away everything they held precious. And their response is to say yes, and we want more of it. Now that we have seen how painful and unfair life can be, we want to go on living. Job's wife says to him on the next to last page of the play, "You looked for justice, didn't you?" Well, there is no justice. There is only love. And then she has these wonderful closing lines. The candles in churches are out. The stars have gone out in the sky. Blow on the coal of the heart, and we'll see by and by. Great. Do you understand what she means by that? She's saying to Job, don't look for answers why we had to suffer like this, why our children had to die. Don't look for answers why, not in theology and not in science. The candles in churches are out, the stars have gone out in the sky. The only place to look for an answer, and it won't be an explanation, an answer why. It'll be a response, an answer, what are we going to do about it now? The only place to look is in your own heart. Blow on the coal of the heart. It would be nice if we could count on the world to keep us warm and safe. I wish it were that kind of a world. My life, my job would be a lot easier, and so would yours. But it's not that kind of a world. And the sooner we realize that, the better we'll be able to cope with it. Blow on the coal of the heart. Don't ask the world to keep you warm. You shed your warmth on the world. Have you suffered? Have you known tragedy in your life? Take the white heat of your pain and your anger and turn them into something which will send light and warmth into somebody else's life. The widow whose husband has died of cancer. I would understand it if she stayed home and moped all day, never put on makeup, never put on a dress. But she doesn't. She goes out and becomes neighborhood collection chairman for cancer research. The family whose story I tell in my book, whose son is run over by the school bus coming home from school one day. I would have no argument with them if for the rest of their lives they were bitter and jealous of other people. Because every time they buy a pack of gum and give it out, and they have one stick of gum left over, they're reminded of the child who was killed. But they don't do that. They go out and they work for higher school bus safety standards so no other family will have to suffer what they've suffered. This is blowing on the coal of the heart. Even if the only difference your own sorrow has made to you is that now you know what the soul of the grieving person feels like. So you will reach out and not hold back. So you will say the right things and not the wrong things. This is blowing on the coal of the heart. You know, for 3,000 years, we've been asking the question, why do good people suffer in God's world? And nobody's been able to answer it. Not Rabbi Akiba, and not St. Augustine, and not Maimonides, and certainly not Harold Kushner. We haven't been able to answer it because it's the wrong question. Why is not the question. The question is, what are you going to do about it? How will you respond? The question perhaps becomes this. Are you capable of forgiving the world for being an unfair, unpredictable place, and loving it and wanting to go on living in it anyway, no matter what happens to you? Because, God help us, it may be the only world we have. Are you capable of forgiving people who didn't know what you needed or couldn't give it to you? Because, you know, that's what love is. Love is not admiring somebody for being perfect. Love is accepting somebody with all of his imperfections and praying that he accepts you with all of yours. And finally, the hardest question that I have to ask you tonight, and the hardest question for you to hear: can you forgive God? Can you forgive God for choosing not to create a perfect world where the right thing would always happen and we would be safe? Can you get over your disappointment in him? Because God loves goodness more than he loves perfection. And instead of creating a predictable world where the right thing had to happen, he created an unpredictable world where the right thing will only happen if you and I make it happen. So that, as the Talmud says, when a man chooses to do something right, God looks down from heaven and says, for this moment alone, it was worth creating the world. But in the meantime, all sorts of terrible things have happened to good people along the way. And if you can do that, if you're capable of that kind of forgiveness and that kind of love, will you recognize your own capacity to forgive and to love? Will you recognize your own ability to survive, to transcend, and to reach out to others? Will you recognize them as the divine gifts that God has given you so that you can go on living meaningfully no matter what the world deals you? Can you do that? Blow on the coal of the heart, and we'll see by and by. Thank you.
If you have found heartening and or inspiring words in this program when bad things happen to good people, and it would be remarkable if you didn't, why not show your support to Channel 2 for bringing you this kind of programming, and call now, 492-1111. We urgently need your pledges of support to continue bringing you exceptional programming like that which you've just seen. We'll be talking live with Rabbi Harold Kushner in just a few moments. 492-1111. We have only 5 days before the end of the fiscal year here at Channel 2, midnight, August 31st. So call in with your pledge of support now.
When Bad Things Happen to Good People was made possible in part by this public television station, which depends largely upon viewer contributions. Please join with your support.